Welcome to Scary Night Stories, the place where fear comes alive in every tale. Turn off the lights, wrap yourself in a blanket, and get ready. Your deepest fears are already here. The mysterious house on the outskirts. I have always been a fan of urban legends and creepy stories. As a child, I would spend hours listening to my grandfather, who spoke in hushed tones about ghosts, cursed objects, and mysterious creatures dwelling on the border between our world and something unimaginably dark. As I grew up, my attraction to the unknown only strengthened. In every new place I moved to, I began to explore local rumors and tales, trying to find an old mansion with ghosts, or an abandoned village church holding a dark secret. But never did my hunt for mysticism lead to anything truly dangerous. It was always limited to eerie, yet harmless events. A cracked statue in a cemetery, creaking floors in an old house, a chilling wind in an abandoned school. However, a few months ago, I moved to a small town called Nevestino. At first glance, nothing much stood out here. A residential area, a couple of decent cafes, a statue of some obscure marshal in the town square, and an ancient church built at the beginning of the last century. As usual, the first thing I did was to search for local scary stories. Neighbors were unusually silent and reluctant to share their tales. But one elderly man, upon hearing of my interest, whispered to me about the house on the outskirts, where no one had lived for almost half a century. According to him, this house was not just abandoned, but cursed. Allegedly, terrible events took place there. People vanished without a trace, and witnesses claimed to have seen ghosts in the windows or flickering lights at night. Even the police were sent there in the past, but they returned pale and trembling, refusing to discuss what had happened inside. The house acquired a sinister reputation. Many residents of the surrounding streets tried to pass by quickly, not lingering near the peeling walls and overgrown yard. During the rare attempts to sell or demolish the house, accidents occurred. Workers injured their hands, machines broke down, documents were lost or disappeared from archives. In short, no one dared interfere with the fate of this house, and it continued to rot behind crooked shutters on the very edge of town, as if submerged in eternal twilight. I didn't believe the rumors. Well, only partially. My journalistic itch. Yes, I worked as a freelance writer for an online publication, demanded that I verify everything for myself. The mysterious story about a house that seemed to swallow people was too enticing to pass up. I decided to investigate the house on the outskirts and write a report or shoot a short film about it. At first, I tried to study the city hall archives, but, as luck would have it, access to old documents was denied. I had to submit a request and wait several days. I didn't want to wait, so I decided to go straight in, at my own risk. I decided to set out in the evening, when twilight was just beginning to thicken. The perfect time to feel the atmosphere of true horror. I took with me a powerful flashlight, a camera, a voice recorder, spare batteries, as well as several candles and matches, just in case there was no electricity. Though, of course, I didn't expect the house to even be connected to a power grid. Additionally, I brought a small protective amulet that my grandmother had given me. Grandma always said that such things ward off any evil. I always treated that with irony, but this time I decided not to take any risks. On the way to the house, I experienced strange premonitions. Doubts churned in my soul. What if the rumors were at least partly true? After all, there's a grain of truth in every tale. And here, a house spoken of in urban legends. But curiosity and excitement propelled me forward. As I walked, the sun set on the horizon, and the sky filled with dense twilight, with occasional rosy glows in the west. On the outskirts of the town, the roads became emptier. No cars, no people strolling. Just me and the dim streetlights at intersections. The silence was so unnatural that each of my steps echoed loudly. Finally, I reached the last street, beyond which lay fields and wastelands. Beyond that was only a ramshackle fence dividing the town from the unused old land, overgrown with burdock and thorny bushes. And there, behind those thorny thickets, stood the house. The house indeed looked ominous. A 2-story building with a gabled roof and tall chimney. It seemed to rise from the darkness. The windows had no glass. They were either covered with plywood sheets or were simply gaping holes. Parts of the facade were peeling and covered in dark mold, and near the entrance, it appeared that remnants of old furniture lay scattered. A half-rotted wardrobe, a stool with rusted nails sticking out, and a broken chandelier lying crookedly, as if it had been thrown off a balcony. The main door, a massive oak door with a curved shape, was haphazardly boarded up. It seemed as if someone had repeatedly tried to break it open, then board it up, and then tear those boards off again. There was no sign of living presence anywhere, no lights, no indication of human activity. Only a cold wind blowing from the wastelands made the dry leaves rustle underfoot. I took out my camera and started recording. While filming, I directed the beam of my flashlight at the door. The panel with broken hinges was all scratched, as if someone had clawed at the wood. A shiver ran through me. My imagination immediately conjured clawed hands, reaching out from within. But I didn't let panic take over, and stepped toward the doorway, pushing the door with my shoulder. The door yielded with a plaintive creak, and before my eyes lay a dark foyer. I shone my flashlight inside. The walls were coated in crumbling plaster, and the floor beneath my feet was dust, what once was likely a carpet. It smelled of dampness and something else, an unpleasant mix of bitter smoke and mold. A strange feeling crept into my heart, as if the house watched me with its empty windows, and sensed that I had trespassed into its domain. I stepped inside. In the foyer stood a ragged cupboard, its doors torn off. Perhaps coats and hats were once stored there. The walls bore old wallpaper, parts of which had peeled off. I stepped further into the corridor. The camera hummed quietly. The flashlight illuminated patterns of cracks on the walls, and a collapsed staircase leading to the second floor. Suddenly, somewhere on the second floor, a loud thump echoed, as if something heavy had been dropped. I flinched. The sound echoed through the empty rooms, and then died away. My heart pounded so hard I thought the entire rickety house might hear it. I stopped, trying to listen. Silence returned. Absolute this time. Only my breathing and the rustle beneath my feet broke the quiet. Maybe rats are running about, I thought, or the boards are giving way from decay. No need to panic. However, the deeper I ventured, the stronger I felt another presence. It was an almost physical sensation, as if invisible eyes were boring into me with their gaze. My mouth dried up, and a lump of fear rose in my throat. It seemed as though the doors of the rooms were reproachfully staring at me, with their black, rectangular openings. I turned right, toward a doorway I saw ahead. Beyond it lay a spacious room, seemingly a living room. A faint, lunar glow shone through a broken window. In the far corner stood an old grandfather clock with a shattered face. Its hands were missing, but the pendulum inside still swayed slightly, just a little, as if it had been touched recently, though I hadn't touched it. At the sight of the moving pendulum, a chill froze my chest. Where could this movement have come from? The wind? But I didn't feel any draft. I approached with my flashlight. The pendulum continued its quiet, almost silent swing. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Although there was no ticking sound, I somehow heard the rhythm in my head. A deep pulsation. My imagination or something more. I was almost hypnotized. I stared at the pendulum and couldn't look away. Suddenly I felt an intense chill on my skin, as if someone had touched my neck with an icy palm. I spun around sharply. No one was there. The room was empty. Only deathly silence in this dilapidated interior. Deep in my consciousness, I heard a barely discernible whisper, but couldn't make out the words. With difficulty, I tore myself from the stupor and practically ran back into the corridor. My heart was pounding. I tried to steady myself. Pull yourself together, I told myself. You wanted to find signs of mysticism, right? Here they are. Strange feelings, rustling sounds, a pendulum. These are all part of your report. But even realizing that I had been seeking such events didn't help dispel the unpleasant chill inside. To calm myself, I decided to peek into the next room. It turned out to be something like a dining room. In the center stood a huge dining table, noticeably slanted. Chairs lay overturned around it. I waved my flashlight along the walls and stumbled upon several family photographs in cracked frames. One depicted a middle-aged man in a strict suit. Next to him was a woman with sad eyes and 2 children, a boy and a girl. A shiver ran down my spine when I noticed that someone had carefully scratched out the faces of the children with a sharp object. In their place were deep scratches, as if someone in a rage had tried to erase their images. On another photograph was the same woman, but alone. From her expression and slumped arms, it was clear she was in despair. The photo was gray and blurred, as if taken in a hurry. Below it was a signature in sprawling handwriting. "Forgive me. I could not protect you." The letters had faded slightly, but were still legible. I began to wonder what happened to this family. According to accounts, the house had been empty for about 50 years, so the events must have taken place in the mid-20th century. Did the whole family perish? Or just the children? Maybe they'd disappeared. Or did the woman go insane from grief? A stream of thoughts enveloped me as I continued examining the photographs. Suddenly, a soft rustle came from nearby, and I instinctively stepped back. To the left, a narrow doorway in the wall led to the kitchen. From there came a sound like a knife scraping against metal. My heart beat faster, but curiosity got the better of me. I cautiously approached the opening and shone my flashlight. The kitchen was small, with remnants of an old stove and crumbling cabinets. In the middle of the room stood a dining table, its top fallen off, exposing musty boards inside. Broken dishes lay scattered everywhere. The smell of mold was stronger here than in other rooms, and in the corner, a dark stain looked like dried blood. I slowly walked along the walls, trying not to step on shards to avoid making noise. Yet every step echoed loudly under the high ceiling. I felt that life once bustled here. People cooked, laughed, talked. But now, only cold shadows remained. Suddenly, the scraping of a knife repeated, as if someone was dragging it across the stone countertop. I jumped in surprise. The sound came from the corner where the old oven stood. I cautiously approached, trying to film everything I saw. But there was nothing except a rat's nest and a pile of shattered dishes. Probably a rat, I thought again, though I didn't really believe it. The sound was too deliberate, as if someone deliberately wanted to attract attention, giving a signal. I'm here. I involuntarily glanced at the old kitchen cupboard by the oven. Its door was slightly ajar, and inside was pitch darkness. I momentarily lowered my camera and touched the door. It creaked. Slowly prying it open wider, I discovered inside a pile of yellowed newspapers. I became curious if there might be mentions of events in the house. I took one of the newspapers and carefully unfolded it. It was a local district paper from 1973. In one of the issues, there was mention of a tragedy. The disappearance of 2 children from a family. Searches continue. My hands trembled with emotion. Outside the kitchen, beyond its confines, another loud knock sounded, now completely distinct. I froze. The knocking repeated at short intervals. Thud, thud. Thud, thud. As if someone were descending the stairs heavily. I need to check that, I thought, even though every instinct told me not to. Common sense screamed that I should leave, but journalistic curiosity and some strange calling pulled me up the stairs. Meanwhile, the knocking subsided as soon as I left the kitchen and returned to the corridor. I stood at the base of the stairs. From above came a suffocating cold, and for a moment I thought I heard a child crying. A quiet, plaintive cry coming from deep within the rooms. I began to ascend cautiously, step by step, trying not to breathe loudly. The boards creaked underfoot. It seemed they would give way at any moment. The second floor greeted me with dampness and darkness. Several doors led into different rooms. At the end of the corridor was a window without glass, through which dim moonlight barely filtered, but mostly there was utter darkness. Turning right, I noticed that the door to the first room was slightly ajar, and from it seemed to emanate a faint light, whether moonlight or some ghostly glow. I raised my camera, switched on night mode, and carefully entered. The room turned out to have once been a children's room. The walls were covered with wallpaper depicting bears and heroes from old cartoons, eaten away by time. In the corner stood a doll missing an eye. Its plastic face was cracked, lips parted in a grotesque grimace. The floor was strewn with children's toys, many of which were contorted as if someone had trampled and torn them apart. Then I heard a hoarse whisper. It seemed to come right next to me. Help them. They are still here. I turned around, and the beam of my flashlight caught a strange figure behind a wardrobe. It lacked clear outlines. It was a translucent shadow, tall and gaunt. I recoiled, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. The shadow stood motionless, yet I clearly felt that it was watching me. A dreadful silence hung, broken only by my ragged breaths. My throat went dry. I couldn't utter a word. I slowly, as if entranced, put down my camera and raised the flashlight a little higher. The shadow swayed as if taking a step forward. At that very moment, static crackled through my headphones. I was listening to the recording through a small microphone. The flashlight flickered. The shadow vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind a barely perceptible whispering sound. I dashed back into the corridor, barely maintaining my composure. I wanted to run away, but I understood that my recording wasn't finished, and the answers lay somewhere inside this cursed house. And that eerie whispered help them seemed to tug at my conscience. Who should I help? The children? Their spirits? At the opposite end of the corridor was another door, this time locked. I tried turning the knob, and it gave way. The door led into a room resembling an adult's bedroom. There stood a massive bed with a broken headboard, a bedside table against the wall, and a dresser in the corner. I approached the table. In one of its drawers, I found a worn-out hardcover diary. I opened it and saw that it was someone's personal diary, half-filled. The handwriting was feminine and neat, but the lines were smudged. In places, letters were blurred, probably from tears. On the cover, the name Olga was visible, though the last letters had worn off. The first entry was dated July 10th, 1973. Today, my children disappeared. They went out to play in the yard and never returned. We searched everywhere. No trace. The police promised to continue the search, but I have a bad feeling. I frantically flipped further. The entries became increasingly desperate. The woman described hearing footsteps and children's laughter in the corridor at night, feeling cold, and seeing shadows in the corners. She wrote that the house seemed to lock itself, and that the exit would vanish when she tried to escape at night. In one of the last entries were trembling lines. He came for them. That dark silhouette with empty eyes. I begged him to return my children, but he only stood there whispering something I could not understand. I am afraid he is not human. Perhaps the house itself is alive. Or is it something ancient that has inhabited its walls? The entries then abruptly ended, and on the last page was hastily scrawled, "Forgive me, I couldn't..." And instead of a period, a blot of dried ink, I realized that the woman probably went insane from terror. Perhaps she saw the very shadow I encountered. But what happened to the children? Judging by the newspaper article, they were never found. When I finished reading, echoes of footsteps filled the corridor. Someone seemed to be pacing back and forth slowly. A dreadful tension filled the air, as if the house had come alive, squeezing me in its embrace. I placed the diary in my backpack. Perhaps it would serve as evidence, and cautiously stepped back into the corridor. The footsteps ceased, but I clearly heard faint children's voices, as if crying behind a wall. They were crying and calling for their mother. A chill ran down my spine. Perhaps these were the very children's spirits still wandering in this house. Or was it the house itself, playing with me like a cat with a mouse? I moved toward the sound, but the voices faded away, leading me further down the corridor. I passed another room, empty and filled with junk, until I reached a narrow staircase leading to the attic. The voices seemed to come from there. The staircase to the attic was even more decrepit and dust-covered than the previous one. As I climbed, I felt a chilling cold, as if a polar wind blew from above. Stepping into the half-dark space, I illuminated old chests and boxes with my flashlight. A burnt-out light bulb hung from the ceiling. On the floor, I noticed strange symbols drawn in chalk, and here and there, red paint. They resembled magical signs or seals. The walls of the attic were scrawled with children's handwriting. "Mom, we are here. Help us. We can't get out." And other sorrowful phrases that made my heart ache. I walked to the center of the attic, where the floor was slightly sunken, and suddenly I heard a rustle behind me. I turned around. Against the dim light from a small dormer window appeared that very tall, dark entity again. Its outlines pulsed like clouds of smoke. Its eyes were absent in the darkness, but I felt its gaze. "Give them back," I whispered, not knowing why I uttered these words, as if some other will spoke through me. "Return them to peace." The darkness stirred, and from the entity several faint, translucent figures seemed to emerge. I made out the outlines of a boy and a girl. They looked at me with empty eyes. The children raised their hands, as if pleading for help, and dissolved into the air. The shadow let out a quiet moan or roar, sounding both in my ears and in my mind. A wave of terror washed over me. I stood motionless, paralyzed, feeling something alien invading my thoughts. "Stay, stay," whispered that thing, and before my eyes images appeared. A suffering woman tearing her hair out in a children's room, screaming children being swallowed by a black void. Gathering my will, I remembered the grandmother's amulet around my neck. My fingers touched the cool metal. I didn't know if it had any real power, but in desperation I clutched the amulet and closed my eyes, focusing on thoughts of light and protection. It felt like several endless minutes passed. The air around thickened. The pressure increased. Then suddenly, I heard a loud crack, like the house shuddering from within. Then everything fell silent, and I realized I no longer felt the alien presence in my mind. I cautiously opened my eyes. The entity was gone. On the attic floor, I saw a faint glimmer, as if someone's tears had fallen on the boards, and I made out the outlines of two little figures. They stood a few steps away, holding hands. Then the figures seemed to nod at me in gratitude and melted into the air, along with a faint light. Inside me was an overwhelming feeling of emptiness and relief at the same time. It seemed as if the house breathed, but now no longer as hostilely. Perhaps the children's souls had finally found peace, even if only for a moment. I didn't want to stay in that house for another second. The corridors were still dim, but now they looked more weary than sinister. I briskly returned to the staircase, trying not to look around. A strange feeling persisted, the sense that the house was still alive, but letting me go, acknowledging that I had somehow helped free its victims. Descending to the first floor, I caught a sharp smell of smoke. Somewhere closer to the exit, smoke was streaming. It turned out that the boards in the corridor were smoldering. Apparently, the old wiring had short-circuited, or some remaining wires made contact after my interference. The fire had already begun spreading along the walls. In a panic, I dashed to the front door, feeling the heat and acrid smell filling my lungs. Fortunately, though the door creaked, it opened easily, and I literally tumbled outside. Fresh air struck my face. I coughed, trying to gather myself. Looking back, I saw tongues of flame bursting through the windows, lighting up the dark night with red-orange flashes. It seemed the house was doomed to destruction. Soon the flames would engulf it completely. I moved to a safe distance and pulled out my camera. The recording was still running. With trembling hands, I captured the final frames, the burning mansion. And just before the roof collapsed, I thought I saw in the flashes of flame the silhouette of those very children for a moment, after which the roof collapsed with a deafening crash. A pillar of sparks shot into the sky, and the house was consumed by fire. Firefighters arrived only at dawn. I stood nearby, completely exhausted, trembling all over in the cold wind. Smoke still rose from the charred remains. None of the townspeople knew how or why the house had caught fire, but it seemed everyone felt a strange relief as if a decades-long curse had finally been lifted. In my hands, I had evidence, the footage on my camera, and the diary of the unfortunate woman. When I returned home and downloaded the video onto my computer, part of the files were corrupted by inexplicable interference. Those very moments when I saw the shadow and heard the children's voices were recorded distorted and choppy. But something survived. Enough to piece together the story. The mysterious house, the family tragedy, the sinister entity that kept the children's souls captive. After the fire, the authorities completely leveled the remaining ruins. Over time, perhaps something new will be built here, a supermarket or shopping center. Will the dark forces burn away with the house and its curse? Or will they simply hide deeper, biding their time until they find a new abode? Now, as I finish telling this story, the images of those children surface in my memory. Their empty eyes, full of pleading. Have they finally passed into another world where they will find peace? I want to believe so, because every time in a half-sleep I hear faint children's voices, I want to believe that these are nothing more than echoes of memories. Or perhaps it is the very shadow calling you. And then, you must decide for yourself if you can answer its call without losing yourself within those cursed walls. This story began many years ago in Marlow County, Maine, where an ancient, almost untouched forest lay. Locals called it the Purple Forest. Rarely did tourists visit Marlow, and those who did often laughed off the strange tales of bizarre phenomena and missing people before moving on to fish by the rivers or boat on the nearby lakes. But for the residents of Marlow, the Purple Forest had a special, almost reverent place in their lives. Early in the mornings, a thick, purplish mist often blanketed the forest, giving it its name. Authorities never managed to figure out its origin. Some claimed it was the result of rare evaporation phenomena, while others believed it was an optical illusion caused by the rising sun. There were even rumors of ancient stones deep within the forest, said to emit a faint glow. Of course, no scientific proof ever surfaced. The town of Marlow itself was classic small-town America. 2- and 3-story houses, Victorian-style mansions, family diners, a couple of gas stations, a roadside motel, and a combined police station and town hall. This quiet place became home to the O'Brien family a few years back, a perfect retreat from the noise of big cities and the endless congestion of traffic. John O'Brien, the head of the family, had once worked as a security guard at a Chicago bank, but after moving to Marlow, he took up the position of sheriff. His wife, Karen, opened a small bakery on Main Street, dreaming of drawing in customers with the aroma of fresh cookies and a cozy atmosphere. Their daughter, Ellie, short for Eleanor, had just graduated high school and was preparing to attend college. While waiting for an admission response, she spent her days in Marlow with a new group of friends: Sam Thompson, Jessica Miller, and twins Colin and Chris Watson. The group loved hiking, photographing wildlife, and sharing local ghost stories. Inevitably, their curiosity led them to the Purple Forest. The end of summer had arrived, a carefree time of warm evenings, the scent of freshly cut grass, and dwindling numbers of tourists. The group decided to go on a weekend camping trip, a short adventure with a campfire, marshmallows, and scary stories under the stars. they picked the northern edge of the purple forest as their campsite, a place where, according to locals, few dared to venture. None of them thought of themselves as particularly brave. Camping in a haunted forest was more of a joke, a way to tease each other and see who would get spooked first. Yet, as the 5 friends followed an overgrown path into the woods, a strange unease settled over them. The air seemed heavier, and the sun slipped behind the clouds as they stepped onto the damp, mossy ground. "Well," Sam said, looking around, "this seems like a great spot for camping, doesn't it?" "It's creepy," Jessica muttered, crossing her arms. "I feel like someone's watching us from the trees." The twins, Colin and Chris, exchanged nervous glances but tried to laugh it off. Chris, always the braver one, shrugged. "Come on, this place is perfect. We'll set up the tents, hang a hammock, and by tonight, we'll all be laughing around the fire." Ellie, though less confident, agreed they should start pitching the tents before it got dark. The group busied themselves with the task, staking down the fabric, tying ropes, and unpacking supplies. As they worked, the light faded unnaturally fast. In most forests, dusk falls gently, blending into the night. Here, darkness seemed to descend suddenly, like a curtain drawn over the sky. Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by something vast and unseen. A light breeze stirred the treetops, and the distant crack of a breaking branch echoed faintly. The group sat around their small campfire, its warm glow casting flickering shadows on their faces and the surrounding trees. The mood shifted as they began sharing tales about the legends of the Purple Forest. They spoke of the forest spirit, said to lure wanderers with ghostly sounds, leading them in endless circles until they succumbed to hunger or madness. Sam, grinning, shared an urban legend about glowing lights in the woods that acted as beacons for those foolish enough to follow them. "This is all so cliché," Jessica scoffed, though there was a slight tremor in her voice. "Forest spirits, ghosts. Every forest in Maine seems to have some spooky story." "But not every forest has a purple mist," Colin teased, gesturing dramatically. "And hey, whether or not there's a spirit, this place definitely has weird vibes. It got so cold so fast. Indeed, the temperature had dropped noticeably." Ellie rubbed her arms, feeling a chill creep over her skin. The darkness seemed to press closer, swallowing the light of their fire. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, and the group fell silent for a moment, listening to the rustling leaves. Sensing the rising tension, Ellie suggested changing the subject. "We're only here for one night," she said, forcing a laugh. "Let's not give ourselves nightmares." They started talking about lighter topics, favorite bands, future plans, but the forest seemed to hum with an unspoken presence. Eventually, their laughter faded, and fatigue set in. The fire burned lower, casting faint red embers into the cool night air. Just as they were preparing to retreat to their tents, Jessica stiffened. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. "Hear what?" Sam asked, sitting up straighter. It was faint, but unmistakable. Soft, deliberate footsteps on the damp forest floor, somewhere just beyond the firelight. The sound paused, then resumed, growing louder with each step. The rhythm was odd, uneven, almost like someone limping. Everyone froze. Their breaths were shallow, eyes scanning the dark woods for movement. "Maybe it's a deer," Chris said, his voice shaky. But deep down, they all knew it wasn't. The sound was too calculated, too human. Ellie gripped her flashlight tightly, her palms sweaty. She pointed its beam toward the edge of the clearing, sweeping the trees. The light danced over the moss and trunks, catching nothing unusual, until it did. Standing between two large pines was a shadowy figure, unnaturally tall and thin, its head tilted at an odd angle, as if studying them. It didn't move, but its very presence was suffocating. For a heartbeat, no one spoke or moved. Then, in an instant, the figure was gone, vanishing into the darkness as if it had never been there. The footsteps stopped. "What the hell was that?" Sam whispered, his voice trembling. He fumbled at his side for anything to defend himself. A stick, a rock. Though deep down, he felt whatever this was couldn't be fought off with weapons. Ellie kept her flashlight trained on the spot where the figure had stood, her heart pounding. I think we need to leave," she finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now, before it comes back." But leaving meant navigating the dark forest at night, a prospect just as terrifying as staying put. They huddled closer, fear etched into their faces. The minutes dragged into an hour. The fire, now little more than embers, provided a meager barrier between them and the black void of the forest. Every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch sent shivers down their spines. "Should we take turns keeping watch?" Colin suggested, his voice breaking the silence. "Just in case. You know, that thing comes back." Everyone nodded reluctantly. They decided 2 people would stay awake at a time, while the others tried to sleep. Sam and Ellie volunteered to take the first watch, clutching flashlights and huddling close to the dying fire. The night was eerily quiet. Even the wind had died down, leaving only the faint, irregular drip of water from the trees. Ellie's grip on her flashlight tightened as her thoughts spiraled. She couldn't shake the image of the shadowy figure, its unnatural stillness, the way it had seemed to watch them. "I don't like this," Sam muttered, breaking the silence. "It feels like the forest is alive, like it's waiting for something." Ellie nodded, but before she could respond, they heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were closer, circling the clearing. The 2 froze, barely daring to breathe. The sound was slow, deliberate, moving just beyond their line of sight. Ellie's flashlight flickered, the batteries suddenly faltering. "No, no, no," she whispered, shaking it frantically. The beam dimmed, then went out completely. Panic set in. "Wake the others," Sam hissed, his eyes scanning the darkness. Ellie scrambled to her feet, shaking Jessica awake. "It's back," she whispered urgently. The footsteps grew louder, more erratic, as if the thing was toying with them. When Colin and Chris woke, they too heard it, their faces pale in the firelight. And then it stopped. Complete silence fell over the clearing, so absolute it was deafening. The group stared into the dark, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. A long, low creak broke the silence, like a massive branch bending under an invisible weight. Ellie aimed her dead flashlight toward the sound, but it was useless. They were utterly blind, at the mercy of whatever lurked in the forest. When dawn finally arrived, it brought with it a thin, gray light that barely penetrated the forest canopy. The group emerged from their tents, exhausted and on edge. The night's horrors clung to them like a heavy fog, and none of them could shake the feeling of being watched. As they began packing up their campsite, Ellie noticed something strange. Scattered across the clearing, in the soft earth around their tents, were footprints. Dozens of them. Some were large, like those of a man, while others were small, childlike. The tracks overlapped and crisscrossed chaotically, as though the clearing had been the site of some eerie midnight gathering. "These weren't here yesterday," Jessica whispered, staring at the prints. Her voice trembled. "Right?" Sam crouched down to inspect them. "Number." "They definitely weren't," he said, glancing uneasily at the surrounding woods. "And they're barefoot." Ellie knelt beside him, her fingers brushing over the impressions. The earth was still damp, and the prints were fresh, too fresh. "Whatever it was," she said, "it was here, right next to us, all night." Jessica clutched her arms, visibly shaking. "We should have left last night. We should have gone the moment we saw that thing. And walked into the forest in the dark. That would have been suicide," Colin said sharply. "At least we're still alive." Chris, who had been silent until now, pointed toward the remnants of their campfire. "What's that?" he asked. The group turned to see a small, twisted object lying amid the ashes. Ellie stepped closer, her stomach tightening as she realized what it was. A clump of long, blonde hair, tangled and singed at the ends. Jessica gasped. "That's not mine," she said quickly, her hands flying to her head. "I swear, it's not mine." Sam carefully picked up the hair, his face grim. "Then whose is it?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. No one responded. A few feet away, Colin found another disturbing item. A strip of torn fabric, dark and sticky with something that looked disturbingly like dried blood. The material didn't match anything they had brought with them. Ellie's heart pounded as a cold realization swept over her. Whatever had been in the forest with them wasn't just watching. It had been in their camp, moving among them as they slept. And it had left behind these grisly traces as a warning. "We need to leave," Ellie said firmly, her voice shaking but resolute. Now, the group quickly packed what little they could carry, abandoning the heavier gear in their haste to escape. They followed the trail that had brought them to the clearing, but something was wrong. The path, which had been clear and distinct the day before, now seemed to twist and change. Familiar landmarks were missing, replaced by unfamiliar terrain. "This isn't right," Sam muttered, stopping abruptly. "We came this way. I remember that tree." He pointed to a gnarled oak. But the path wasn't this overgrown. Ellie bit her lip, trying to suppress the rising panic in her chest. The forest seemed denser now, the trees pressing closer together. Every step forward felt like walking deeper into a trap. "Let's just keep going," Chris said, his voice strained. "The forest can't go on forever, right?" But as they trudged forward, it became clear that they were walking in circles. Twice, they passed the same fallen tree, its roots clawing at the air like skeletal fingers. The third time, they stopped, their frustration boiling over into fear. "We're not going anywhere," Jessica said, her voice breaking. "We're just stuck." Ellie crouched down, running her hands over the mossy ground. She looked up at the others. "I don't think this is just a forest," she said quietly. "It's like it's alive. It's messing with us." "No," Sam said, shaking his head. "That's crazy. It's just a forest. We're panicking, that's all. We just need to think." "And how do you explain the footprints? Or that thing we saw last night?" Colin demanded, his voice rising. "This isn't normal, Sam. You know it isn't." As the argument grew louder, a sound interrupted them. A faint, melodic humming that seemed to come from deep within the forest. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second, the tones discordant and unnerving. Ellie froze, her skin prickling. "Do you hear that?" The others nodded, their eyes wide. The humming wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, something that seemed to seep into their minds, clouding their thoughts and drawing them forward. "We need to go," Ellie said, grabbing Jessica's arm. "Now." But the forest wouldn't let them go so easily. Hours passed as the group wandered through the maze-like forest, their nerves fraying with every step. The air grew colder, and an unnatural silence hung over the woods. Even the birds and insects seemed to have fled, leaving only the sound of their own footsteps and shallow breaths. Just when they were about to give up hope, Colin stopped abruptly. "Wait," he said, pointing at something on the ground. "What's that?" They all gathered around to see what he'd found. A small pile of rusted cans, scraps of tattered cloth, and the remnants of a camping net, half buried in the dirt. Nearby, the bark of a tree bore deep, jagged carvings. A single word, scratched over and over in uneven letters. "Help." "Someone was here before us," Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. He traced the carvings with his finger, his face pale. "A long time ago, by the looks of it." Jessica knelt beside the scraps, pulling out what appeared to be a water-damaged journal. Most of its pages had rotted away, but a few were still legible. Ellie carefully opened the journal, squinting at the faint, smeared handwriting. "They were lost," she murmured, reading aloud. "The forest won't let us leave. We've tried every path. It changes. It traps us." She flipped to another page. "We hear voices at night, see figures in the trees. The forest. It chooses." The final entry was short and chilling. "It demands a sacrifice." A heavy silence fell over the group as they processed the ominous words. "What do you think it means?" Jessica asked, her voice trembling. "I think it means we're not the first ones to get stuck here," Ellie replied grimly. "And if they didn't make it out—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to grow darker, even though the sun should have been high in the sky. The group stumbled upon a steep hill, covered in thick underbrush, and at its summit, they saw a clearing bathed in weak, gray light. "Let's get to higher ground," Sam suggested. "Maybe we can see where to go from up there." It took them nearly an hour to reach the top, slipping on moss-covered rocks and clawing through thorny bushes. When they finally emerged into the clearing, the sight that greeted them chilled them to the bone. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, an unbroken sea of green and gray. There was no sign of the town, the road, or even the campsite they had left behind. "This can't be real," Jessica whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "We can't be this far from the edge of the forest. It's impossible." Ellie stepped closer to the edge of the clearing, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's like the forest swallowed us," she said quietly. Before anyone could respond, Sam pointed at something near the center of the clearing, a crumbling stone structure, half hidden by overgrown vines and moss. It looked like an ancient tomb or mausoleum, its entrance partially collapsed but still accessible. "Do you think there's anything in there?" Colin asked, hesitant but curious. "Only one way to find out," Sam replied, already moving toward the structure. The group hesitated at the entrance, the dark interior of the tomb exuding an icy chill. Ellie's flashlight flickered as she shone it into the opening, revealing a narrow, stone-lined corridor leading into the earth. "This feels like a terrible idea," Jessica muttered, clutching Ellie's arm. "What if it collapses while we're in there?" "Do you want to stay out here with "Whatever's been following us?" Sam asked. That was enough to convince everyone to follow him inside. The air grew colder as they descended into the tomb, the smell of damp earth and decay growing stronger with every step. The walls were lined with strange carvings, symbols and figures that none of them recognized. Some depicted humanoid forms with elongated limbs and twisted faces. Others showed ritualistic scenes with shadowy figures bowing before a horned idol. "What is this place?" Ellie whispered, her voice echoing softly. "I don't think we're supposed to be here," Colin said, his eyes darting nervously between the carvings. At the end of the corridor, they found a small chamber containing a stone sarcophagus. Its lid was adorned with the same symbols that lined the walls, and a faint, almost imperceptible hum seemed to emanate from it. Jessica stepped forward, her curiosity getting the better of her. She reached out to touch the lid, but as her fingers brushed the cold stone, the ground beneath them trembled. A deep, resonant sound echoed through the chamber, and the corridor behind them began to collapse. "Run!" Sam shouted, grabbing Jessica and pulling her back as chunks of stone crashed down around them. The group sprinted back the way they had come, narrowly avoiding the falling debris. When they finally emerged into the clearing, gasping for breath, they turned to see the tomb's entrance completely sealed off. "What the hell was that?" Jessica demanded, her voice shaking. "Something we were never meant to find," Ellie replied, staring at the now closed tomb with a mix of fear and awe. The group barely had time to catch their breath before the forest seemed to react. A low, ominous hum reverberated through the trees, and the temperature dropped sharply. The once still air now carried a faint whispering, an incoherent murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We need to keep moving," Ellie urged, her voice taut with fear. "Whatever's happening, we can't stay here." They stumbled down the hill, their legs shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. As they moved, the forest itself seemed to change again. The paths they had just climbed disappeared, replaced by dense thickets and gnarled roots that tangled their feet. "This is insane," Jessica cried. "We're trapped. It's like the forest is alive." "Stay calm," Sam said, though his own voice betrayed his mounting panic. "We just need to find some sort of landmark, something we can follow out of here." But every direction looked the same. The trees loomed overhead like towering sentinels, their branches knitting together to block out the sky. Even the faint light of day was fading, swallowed by the ever-encroaching shadows. As night began to fall, the group stumbled upon a strange formation in the middle of the forest, a circle of stones arranged in a perfect ring. Each stone was etched with runes, similar to those they had seen in the tomb, and at the center of the circle lay a patch of blackened earth, as though something had burned there long ago. "This doesn't look good," Colin muttered, taking a wary step back. "Nothing about this is good," Ellie replied. She turned to Sam. "What do we do? We can't keep wandering in circles." Sam hesitated, his jaw tightening. "We rest," he said finally. "Just for a little while. We'll need our strength if we're going to find a way out." The group set up a makeshift camp just outside the stone circle, too unnerved to stay within its bounds. They lit a small fire with what little dry wood they could find, huddling close to its warmth as the temperature continued to plummet. Ellie volunteered to take the first watch, her flashlight resting in her lap as the others tried to sleep. The fire cast long, flickering shadows on the trees, and every crackle of a branch made her heart race. She kept her eyes fixed on the darkness, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from the night before emerge from the trees. Hours passed in tense silence. Ellie's eyelids grew heavy, but just as she began to drift off, a faint movement caught her eye. She sat up sharply, shining her flashlight into the trees. At first, she saw nothing, but then out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a glimmer, 2 pinpricks of light, like pale eyes reflecting the fire. "Sam," she whispered, shaking him awake. "There's something out there." Sam bolted upright, grabbing his flashlight and shining it in the same direction. The eyes were gone. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice low. "Something watching us," Ellie replied, her hands trembling. "I swear it was there." The others woke to the sound of their whispers, and soon everyone was on edge, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Then, as if in response to their fear, the whispers began again, soft and distant, but growing louder with each passing second. "It's coming closer," Jessica said, clutching Ellie's arm. "We have to go." "No," Sam said firmly. "If we run, we'll just get more lost. Stay by the fire. Stay together." But the whispers grew louder still, and now they were accompanied by faint footsteps, slow, deliberate, and all around them. The footsteps stopped suddenly, plunging the forest into an oppressive silence. The group huddled together, their eyes darting between the shadows. For a moment, it seemed as though whatever was out there had retreated. Then, without warning, the fire flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Jessica screamed, and chaos erupted as everyone scrambled to relight the fire. Sam managed to ignite a match, but before he could feed it into the kindling, a deep, guttural growl rumbled from the trees. A figure stepped into the faint light of the dying embers. It was tall and impossibly thin, its elongated limbs and twisted face barely human. Its eyes were pale and lifeless, yet they seemed to bore into each of them with an intensity that froze them in place. The creature raised a spindly hand, pointing directly at Chris. "No," Colin whispered, stepping in front of his brother. "You can't have him." The creature tilted its head, its movements unnaturally fluid, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. It stepped closer, its hand still outstretched. "Run," Sam whispered. "Run now." But as they turned to flee, the creature let out a deafening screech, and the forest itself seemed to come alive. Trees groaned and shifted, their branches reaching out like claws to block their path. Chris froze, his body trembling. I can't move," he said, his voice barely audible. Colin grabbed his arm, trying to pull him away, but the creature was already upon them. It seized Chris with its bony fingers, lifting him off the ground as he screamed in terror. "Let him go!" Colin shouted, beating his fists against the creature's arm. But it was no use. The creature turned its pale, lifeless gaze toward Colin, and with a single motion, it hurled him backward into the dirt. Chris's screams echoed through the forest as the creature dragged him into the shadows. The others could do nothing but watch, paralyzed by fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature was gone. The forest fell silent once more. The remaining group stood in stunned silence, staring at the spot where Chris had disappeared. Colin staggered to his feet, tears streaming down his face. "He's gone," he whispered. "He's really gone." Ellie placed a hand on his shoulder. Her own eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. The forest seemed to ease its grip on them after Chris's disappearance. The paths became clearer, the air lighter, and the oppressive whispers faded. It was as though the forest had gotten what it wanted. I think we can leave now," Sam said, though his voice was hollow. But it came at a cost. As they made their way through the now navigable forest, the group stumbled upon the road they had been searching for. The sight of it felt like a miracle, but the weight of their loss hung heavy in the air. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, they saw the search party waiting for them. Ellie's father, Sheriff O'Brien, ran to her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Thank God you're safe," he said, his voice thick with emotion. But the relief was short-lived. When the others explained what had happened, the sheriff's face grew pale. "The forest took him?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ellie nodded, unable to speak. She glanced back at the dark line of trees, half expecting to see the pale eyes watching her from the shadows. Weeks later, the survivors struggled to return to their normal lives. Colin was inconsolable, his grief turning to silence as he shut himself off from the world. Jessica left town, unable to bear the memories of what had happened. Ellie and Sam stayed, but the nightmares followed them wherever they went. The purple forest remained as it always had, silent, still, and shrouded in its mysterious mist. Tourists continued to visit, drawn by the allure of its haunting beauty, but none dared venture too deep. The locals whispered of the forest's curse, warning anyone who would listen to stay far away. But the forest waited, patient and eternal. It had taken its sacrifice, and it would wait for the next. I grew up in the sleepy town of Whispering Pines, tucked away in the misty mountains of northern America. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and gathered on porches to chat about the small, unimportant dramas of everyday life. Surrounded by endless, looming pine trees, it felt as though our town was cocooned in perpetual twilight. The canopy above blocked out so much sun that even midday seemed strangely dim. I never suspected anything truly sinister lurked beyond the gentle hush of those trees. At least, not until a series of disappearances changed everything. My parents used to talk about the old Morgan estate at the far edge of the woods. The massive Victorian house stood abandoned for decades, rumored to be cursed, or at the very least inhabited by malicious spirits. In our youth, we whispered about it around campfires. Local folklore claimed that the Morgans, a once affluent family, had lost their wealth under strange circumstances, leading to madness and tragedy. The father was rumored to have taken his own life, while the mother vanished into the forest one night, never to be seen again. Their only child, a daughter named Charlotte, supposedly roamed the house until she, too, disappeared. By the time I was old enough to ride my bike, the Morgan estate was a place we all avoided. Some people out of superstition, others out of respect for the tragedy that had once befallen it. One summer, the quiet hush of Whispering Pines was shattered by the first disappearance. It was a local teenager, Jake Sullivan, a kid a year older than me, who, by all accounts, had a penchant for sneaking out at night. He often boasted about exploring haunted spots around town, and rumors soon spread that he'd ventured into the Morgan estate. His bike was found abandoned near the rusted, ivy-covered front gates. After weeks of fruitless searching, the authorities gave up. chalking it up to a runaway case, though no one truly believed that. The more skeptical among us shrugged, but those prone to superstition believed the estate had finally claimed a victim when the second person vanished, a young mother named Katie who'd taken an evening stroll with her dog. People grew uneasy. Her dog returned home alone, cowering and whining, though it wore no visible injuries. Whispers started circulating that maybe Jake wasn't the only one lured to that cursed property. Law enforcement combed the area, but the tangled brush and decaying floors of the estate told no clear story. It was as if the house itself refused to yield secrets. I was 17 then, equal parts curious and terrified. The mystique around the estate was irresistible, and although I knew better, I couldn't stop myself from longing to see what lay beyond its broken windows. My best friend, Ari, shared my morbid fascination. We spent hours at the local library poring over old newspaper clippings about the Morgans. Some articles depicted them as tragic victims. Others implied they might have tampered with occult practices, resulting in the horrors that befell their family. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ari and I made a pact. We would sneak into the estate and document our findings. Our plan was simple and naive. Go around dusk, explore a bit, and leave before nightfall truly descended. We told no one, not wanting to spread panic or risk being stopped by worried parents. As we set off into the thinning daylight, my heart pounded in my chest, torn between excitement and dread. The path leading to the Morgan estate felt unnaturally silent. No birds, no wind, just the dull crunch of leaves under our feet. The wrought iron gates stood before us, entwined in thick vines and rust, a silent reminder of the house's long abandonment. Pushing them open, we heard a shrill squeal of metal. It resonated through the stifling air, making both of us shudder. The estate loomed ahead, darker and more imposing than I'd ever imagined. Chipped paint, shattered windows, a porch sinking in on one side, as if the house itself were collapsing under the weight of its own malevolent history. The fading light cast long shadows across the yard, turning every stray object into an ominous silhouette. The air felt stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. The front door was ajar, hanging precariously off one hinge. We exchanged a glance, steeled ourselves, and stepped inside. The foyer was blanketed in dust. Our footsteps kicked up clouds that swirled through the weak beams of fading sunlight. A grand staircase rose before us, each step creaking as if announcing our intrusion. The wallpaper peeled in grotesque sheets, revealing cracked plaster beneath. An unsettling chill clung to the air, far colder than it had been outside, as though the house were sucking away any warmth we brought with us. As we moved deeper, we passed a parlor to our left. Furniture lay toppled in disarray, with a faded rug that might once have been magnificent, but was now riddled with dark, suspicious stains. A corridor to the right led into darkness. The only sources of light were our flashlights and the occasional glow of the setting sun through grimy windows. We heard something above us, a soft rasping, like distant breathing or rustling fabric. Ari and I glanced at each other. Too frightened to speak, we followed the corridor, discovering what appeared to be a library. Most of the shelves were empty, the books likely pilfered by looters long ago. One battered tome remained on a desk near the far wall, its leather cover warped from moisture. Its pages, when we dared open it, contained scribbled notes and diagrams in a language neither of us recognized. The margins bore cryptic symbols, shapes that made my skin crawl. One, in particular, resembled a spiraling eye, repeated so many times it felt like it was staring back at us, alive. We had agreed we'd explore in tandem, but something about that room compelled Ari to linger. She snapped photographs with her phone, determined to capture every eerie detail for our personal investigation. Growing uneasy, I told her I wanted to check the upstairs quickly and urged her not to stray too far. Ari nodded, absorbed in her photography, and I left her alone, not fully grasping the danger of my decision. I made my way back to the staircase, shining my flashlight along the walls. Family portraits, their faces smudged and aged by grime, lined the ascent. The Morgans stared out from behind cracked glass, eyes wide with vacant expressions. One portrait caught my eye. The daughter, Charlotte. She was perhaps 12 or 13, wearing a white dress with lace trim. Her face had an odd smirk, and her eyes seemed alive in a way the others were not. In the flickering beam of my flashlight, her painted gaze felt watchful. On the second floor, the hallway was narrower. The floorboards groaned and the walls seemed to close in. Doors lined the corridor on both sides, many of them sealed, as if the dampness had swollen the frames. One, however, stood slightly ajar, and I felt a pull to investigate. Swallowing hard, I nudged the door open. What greeted me was a small bedroom. The bed frame sat at an odd angle, its mattress stained and partially ripped open. The tattered remains of a canopy hung from the posts, swaying gently in some indiscernible draught. Moldy children's toys littered the floor, stuffed bears with glass eyes missing, a wooden rocking horse with chipped paint. The walls were pale yellow under the peeling wallpaper, and in the corner, on a tiny dresser, I saw a porcelain doll. It wore a white lace dress, remarkably preserved, with long, dark hair that fell in curled strands. Its face was pristine, cheeks rosy, lips painted in a slight pout, but its eyes, those eyes were entirely black, not the usual painted pupils and whites, but gaping pools of ebony that reflected my flashlight like glass orbs. A sudden wave of nausea hit me, as I felt that the doll was staring right into me, penetrating my thoughts. I heard a distant thump from somewhere in the house, maybe the attic or the next room. Quickly, I tried to remind myself that old houses make noise, but the sick feeling in my stomach refused to subside. My instincts screamed, "Leave, now." I turned to head back downstairs to find Ari. That's when I heard her scream. It was a sharp, gut-wrenching cry that reverberated through the hall. My blood froze. Fumbling with the flashlight, I sprinted down the hallway, nearly slipping on the warped boards. I called her name, but only silence answered me. My heart thundered as I rushed back down the stairs and retraced my steps to the library. The overhead chandelier, caked in dust, swung gently as if disturbed by a sudden gust of air. Ari was gone. My flashlight illuminated the desk where we'd found that strange book. Her phone lay abandoned there, still recording. A single photo remained on the screen, blurry, but I could see what might have been a hand in the corner of the frame, fingers pale and twisted. My throat tightened. I called her name again, then followed faint scuff marks on the dusty floor, leading out of the library, deeper into the house. It was as if she'd been dragged or had run frantically, the footprints almost overlapping each other. I followed them down a set of steps I hadn't noticed earlier, a narrow staircase, descending into what must have been the basement. Every step I took felt heavier, as if gravity itself pulled me back. The air was thick with damp and rot, the darkness nearly impenetrable. My flashlight seemed weaker, its beam swallowed by the subterranean gloom. Halfway down, I heard a faint sound, a whisper like hiss, or maybe the echo of quiet sobbing. I couldn't be sure. With each step, the wooden boards threatened to collapse, but I forced myself onward. The basement was unexpectedly large, with winding corridors and small rooms branching off. The walls were stone, coated in greenish mold. Water dripped from the ceiling, forming muddy puddles on the floor. My light revealed archaic symbols etched into the walls. The same spiraling eye, repeated over and over, along with shapes I didn't recognize, but which unsettled me to my core. I thought back to the rumors that the Morgans had meddled in dark rituals. In the harsh glow of my flashlight, those rumors felt all too plausible. Then I spotted something on the ground, Aries' scarf, tangled and torn. I picked it up with shaking hands, scanning the area. An adjacent room caught my eye, the door partially open. Inside, I could see what looked like an altar. Approaching cautiously, I found a crude table smeared with a dark substance. Candles, long extinguished, surrounded it. The walls were plastered with what seemed like frantic handwriting, and more of those spiraling eyes. My heart hammered so loudly, I was sure any presence in the basement could hear it. A faint shuffle made my breath catch. It came from the far corner, where the shadows gathered thickest. Shining my flashlight, I saw a shape, hunched, trembling. It was Ari. She was alive, but something was off. Her eyes were glassy, her face streaked with grime and tears. She slowly turned her head to me, her expression vacant. I rushed to her side, whispering her name, but she didn't respond. Her body was rigid, as though she were fighting something internally. That's when I saw, etched into the skin of her wrist, a small spiral. It wasn't deep, more like a brand or a ritualistic marking. My stomach lurched. She let out a wheezing sound, and I leaned closer to hear her whisper, "She's here. She won't let me go." Ari's eyes flicked to something behind me. I whipped around just in time to see movement in the doorway. A pale figure in a white lace dress, long dark hair matted with dirt. She moved in short, jerky motions, as though she wasn't quite used to walking. Her eyes gleamed in the weak light. They were darker than midnight, reflecting no emotion, just an unsettling emptiness. An unspoken understanding struck me like a bolt of lightning. Charlotte Morgan, in a sudden, impossible motion. Charlotte lunged. I scrambled backward, pulling Ari with me. Charlotte's limbs stretched unnaturally, her fingers almost claw-like. There was an unholy screech that tore through the stale air, and Ari screamed again, this time in pure terror. The figure advanced, every step echoing with the grotesque twisting of old joints. Desperate, I grabbed a broken piece of a wooden chair from the corner. I brandished it in front of me, my mind racing. Charlotte paused, tilting her head as if curious. It was then I noticed a faint aura of darkness that clung to her like a living shadow, pulsating in time with some hidden heartbeat. Though fear nearly paralyzed me, I forced myself to speak. "Charlotte." "Morgan?" My voice sounded tiny, childish. If the figure understood, she gave no sign. She only grinned, a ghastly contortion of her face. A soft rasp escaped her lips, almost like a giggle. My stomach twisted in horror. She lunged again. This time, I thrust the jagged wood toward her. A hideous shriek reverberated as the tip grazed her arm. In that split second, she recoiled with supernatural speed, scrambling back into the corridor, where the darkness swallowed her. I seized the chance. Half carrying, half dragging Ari, I stumbled out of the makeshift altar room, searching for an exit. Every corridor looked the same, but eventually we found a set of stairs that led up. My legs ached. My lungs burned. Still, adrenaline propelled me forward. When we burst back into the main floor hallway, everything felt distorted. The walls seemed to tilt at odd angles, and the furniture was not where I remembered. It was as if the house itself had shifted, rearranging its innards to trap us. Ari mumbled incoherently, repeating something about the eyes. I held her close, scanning for any sign of an exit. A draft of cool air brushed my face. Turning toward it, I saw the front door at the end of the corridor. It stood partially open, the last remnants of twilight beckoning from outside. We sprinted for that sliver of hope. Behind us, we heard that nightmarish giggle again, echoing like a taunt. My vision blurred. I used every ounce of my strength to keep Ari upright and hurl us both through the doorway. Nearly tumbling off the porch as we landed on the overgrown lawn, I didn't stop until we reached the safety of the street. There, I collapsed to my knees, trembling. The estate loomed behind us, silent once more, as though no chase had ever taken place. Ari was breathing but unresponsive. I called 911, stammering out words about an attack, an intruder, anything that might bring immediate help without sounding like a lunatic. She spent days in the hospital, muttering about swirling eyes and pale hands. Doctors chalked it up to a severe panic-induced breakdown, combined with possible toxins from mold exposure. Even after her physical health recovered, Ari refused to speak about what truly happened in the Morgan estate's basement. Over time, her nightmares became less frequent, but the mark on her wrist never fully faded. It remained, a ghostly spiral etched into her skin. I couldn't forget that twisted grin, the unnatural way Charlotte Morgan's figure moved in the darkness. Nor could I reconcile how an entire family's legacy of madness could persist for so long, drawing in new victims decade after decade. Jake Sullivan and Katie, the young mother, were never found. Some in town believed they, too, joined the house's restless spirits. Others whispered they'd seen a second figure in the upstairs window, pale and wide-eyed, standing beside Charlotte. I moved away from Whispering Pines as soon as I turned 18, determined to leave it all behind. Yet the nightmares followed me. Images of that porcelain doll with bottomless black eyes, of the rotting basement walls, and of Ari's horrified face in the flickering flashlight beam. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I hear a faint giggle and the shuffle of feet just outside my door. Not long ago, I received an email from an old neighbor. He attached a photo of the Morgan estate, saying it was about to be demolished to make way for a new housing development. The picture showed the house in daylight, every broken window and sagging plank in stark clarity. But there, in a top-floor window, was the silhouette of a young girl in a white dress, her dark hair framing her face. My blood ran cold at the memory of that grin. I couldn't shake the sense that tearing the house down might not end the curse. Whatever malignant presence lingered in those walls might simply wander, looking for a new place to haunt, or a new host to claim. I never wrote back to my neighbor. There was nothing I could say. Whether the developers demolished the estate or not, I knew Charlotte Morgan would remain. After all, a curse like that doesn't vanish simply because you clear away a few boards. It seeps into the land, buries itself in the roots of the towering pines, It waits patiently for the next curious soul to step off the well-lit path, ready to be swallowed by the ancient darkness. And so I share this story as a warning. If you ever come across an old, abandoned house that gives you pause, trust your instincts. Don't linger for a thrill or for the sake of curiosity. Some doors, once opened, cannot be shut again, and some spirits, once awakened, demand a terrible price. They say whispering pines is still beautiful in the daytime, the forest air crisp and inviting. But if you find yourself near the old Morgan grounds at twilight, listen closely. The pine needles rustle as the wind stirs them, creating the illusion of whispers. And if you listen too long, you just might hear someone calling your name from the darkness. A soft giggle, echoing from a place that no living soul should ever tread. In Northern California, where misty mountain slopes give way to dense groves of giant redwood trees, there's an old rural road that almost nobody remembers. The locals call it the Winding Ribbon. It snakes through the ancient forest, disappearing into a canopy of towering trunks before re-emerging onto a needle-covered clearing. On maps, this route is little more than a narrow path leading to a summer camp abandoned back in the mid-20th century. Once upon a time, children were brought there for fresh mountain air and adventures under the tall trees. But the camp closed down in the 1980s after a series of strange incidents. Tourists bold enough to explore the ramshackle cabins deep in redwood forest would speak of a long, mournful moaning sound echoing between the trees at night, or glimpses of faint lights, like old camp lanterns in the mess hall. Officially, it's considered deserted, its buildings in disrepair, and without any real value. That's exactly where 3 young YouTubers, Ellen, Josh, and Kyle, decided to go. Their channel, Beyond the Camp, specialized in urban legends, abandoned places, and other scary stuff. Their top topic became the so-called Redwood Camp Curse, the sinister rumors about this forgotten spot. They were sitting in a small roadside diner, sipping coffee and poring over old newspaper clippings, when an elderly man approached their table with concern on his face. "Kids, you're not heading to that old camp, are you?" he asked, shaking his head. "What if we are?" Ellen replied, already bracing for another spooky story from a local. "I'd think twice if I were you. Strange things go on in those woods. Back when I was young, people told tales that something roams the fog at night, and it takes those who wander too far." He didn't elaborate further, just gave a heavy sigh, patted them on the shoulder, and walked away. But these 3 thrill-seekers were only spurred on. The scarier the rumor, the more determined they were to investigate. Around midday, they piled into Josh's well-worn pickup truck and took off down the road, which supposedly veered off behind a hill and disappeared into the gloom of towering trees. They drove slowly, not just because of the potholes, but because the deeper they went into the woods, the heavier the air felt. The gigantic redwoods seemed to close in from both sides, forming a canopy overhead so dense that only occasional beams of sunlight filtered through. Though it was only about 3 p.m., the dimness made it feel like dusk. Josh, behind the wheel, announced into a GoPro camera, "Hey there, subscribers of Beyond the Camp. Today, we're heading deep into Redwood Forest to check out an old summer camp that's been abandoned for decades. Rumor has it that something supernatural lurks in these foggy woods. Let's see if we can find out the truth. Kyle, the cameraman and mastermind behind the channel's visuals, filmed everything around them. The eerie forest, branches creaking in the wind, unsettling details like broken road signs and toppled markers. They traveled for miles until they spotted an old wooden archway with peeling paint. Faint letters spelled out Redwood Camp. Welcome. Fallen beams and dead branches were piled beneath the arch. Apparently, no one had set foot here in years. As soon as the pickup truck's wheels entered the campgrounds, it lurched to one side. There was crumbling pavement hidden under the thick blanket of pine needles. Josh winced, fighting for control. "Easy, man," Kyle murmured, lowering his camera. "We don't want to get stuck out here after dark." Ellen peered through the window, biting her lip. They saw a row of old cabins typical of a kids' camp. Wooden structures with shattered windows, collapsed or sagging roofs. Once the truck stopped, an almost tomb-like silence descended. No birds, no insects, nothing. "It's gonna look awesome on camera," Kyle said, and at that moment he thought he glimpsed movement by the tree line. He whipped his head around, but saw only swaying bushes. "Something wrong?" Ellen asked. "Just thought I saw someone," he admitted. Josh shrugged. "In a place like this, every noise feels supernatural. Let's unload the gear, shoot some daytime footage, and then do a night survival inside the abandoned camp." None of them had any idea of the horrors they'd face once darkness fell over the forest. While the sun was still filtering through the canopy, the trio explored the campgrounds on foot. Everywhere they looked, they found the chaotic decay of neglect. Paths blocked by fallen trunks, a thick layer of needles, collapsed platforms, peeling camp signs with unreadable symbols. Following a central lane, they arrived at a large mess hall. Once, it had provided meals for campers, but now all its windows were smashed, and the door hung off its hinges. Inside lay overturned tables, rusty serving counters, and a stale odor of mildew mixed with something sour. "We definitely have to come back here at night," Josh said. "We'll set up flashlights and get some awesome creepy shots. Kyle, you can add some squeaking sound effects in post-production." "Works for me," Ellen agreed. "It's just too quiet. Like the whole forest is dead." They left the mess hall and moved into what seemed to be an administrative area. There was a door labeled "Only Staff." Scattered papers covered a desk, and metal lockers stood with broken doors. In one locker, Kyle found something odd. An old-school backpack containing a child's diary with a plaid cover, dated 1979. "Today we played by the lake. Mr. Jenkins said strange lights appear there at night." "Hey, check this out," Kyle called to the others. "Wonder whose diary this was," Ellen said, flipping through the yellowed pages. "Seems like the kid was writing down spooky stuff." "Let's take it along," Josh suggested. "Might be useful for our video." They continued exploring. A broken pier at the edge of a small lake, the remnants of a climbing wall, and even an old guard post. It felt like everyone here vanished all at once, leaving everything behind. Ellen spent the whole day with the feeling that someone was watching them. She'd catch a glimpse of a shadow in a cabin window, or hear a rustle too close for comfort. Yet every time, they found no proof of anyone else around. By evening, clouds gathered overhead, and a cool mist began to drift among the trees. The group went back to the pickup, set up tents, and cooked a quick meal on a portable stove. They were ready for the highlight of their trip: Nighttime filming at the infamous cursed camp. Gray twilight quickly turned to utter darkness. The tall redwoods stood like towering giants in the dim glow of the crescent moon. The thick carpet of pine needles muffled every footstep. Kyle held the camera, while Josh and Ellen carried flashlights and extra lighting gear. Their plan was simple: do a final walkthrough after dark and shoot a night tour for their subscribers. Kyle would film from a first-person perspective, while Josh and Ellen provided commentary on what they saw. Their audience loved these horror walkthrough formats. They started at the cabins on the camp's east side. By moonlight, the small structures looked even creepier. Broken windows caught silver beams, and tree branches cast long, distorted shadows. One of the cabins was rumored to be where a boy went missing in 1979 and was never found. Could this diary belong to him? Ellen wondered, but she kept her thoughts private for now. "Hey, guys. This is Beyond the Camp," Josh whispered into the camera. "It's midnight, and we're standing in the long-forgotten Redwood camp. Locals say you can still hear voices at night, from those who vanished without a trace." Somewhere behind them, a branch snapped. Ellen swung her flashlight into nearby bushes. Nothing, just swaying shadows. The fog creeping along the ground made it all the more unnerving. "Folks, I keep feeling like someone's around," Ellen admitted on camera. "Or maybe I'm too jumpy." They pressed on, trying to stay quiet. Along the way, they passed a deserted playground, a ripped volleyball net, and a small chapel that was half collapsed. Its cross dangled precariously, rusted bolts barely holding it in place. "Let's film a few shots inside," Josh suggested. "Might be atmospheric." As soon as they stepped in, a draft flung the rotted door behind them into the wall with a dull thud. Under their flashlights, they saw rows of broken pews, plus a half-collapsed altar. Ellen approached it and caught a sudden whiff of burning, though nothing seemed to be on fire. "You smell that?" She sniffed the air. "Smoke or something scorched." "Probably some old fire pit," Kyle guessed, lifting the camera. "But we're not seeing any signs of one." Just then, Ellen saw something dark flicker behind a column to her left. She let out a tiny yelp and swung her flashlight. Kyle turned his camera that way, but the space was empty. I swear, there was something... short, dark clothing. Ellen's voice trembled. "Okay, calm down," Josh said, though his own grip on the flashlight tightened. "Let's check." They moved toward the column. Darkness pressed in on them. Their beams revealed only a broken, mold-stained wall and cobwebs hanging from the cracked ceiling. "Nobody here," Kyle murmured. "But you couldn't have imagined it. Maybe someone really is lurking." They stepped back outside and found the fog had grown denser, swirling at their ankles. As they retreated, the church door slammed shut behind them on its own. The sound echoed like a gunshot, sending chills through them, but they tried to dismiss it as wind. "Better keep filming somewhere else," Josh said. Even so, none of them could shake the sensation that someone, or something, was watching from the dark brush. Their next destination was the mess hall, the spot rumored to show strange lights at night. Approaching the building, they noticed how the fog parted around it, revealing a black outline of the structure. In the distance, they heard faint rustling, like movement inside. Josh gestured for them to stay silent. "This is creeping me out," Kyle muttered, pulling his hood up against the damp air. "Yeah, but this is why we came," Ellen said quietly, hugging the diary in her pack. They climbed the mess hall's front steps, rotting boards that groaned underfoot, Inside, an unpleasant mixture of musty decay and sourness hit their nostrils. A broken ventilation pipe dangled from the ceiling, and trash and broken utensils littered the floor. They scanned the place with their flashlights, hoping to catch anything interesting on camera. Suddenly, a sharp sound, half shuffle, half moan, made them freeze. It came from the far corner, near a door to the back room. "Careful," Josh breathed, creeping over. Ellen and Kyle followed. Their beams lit the space behind the old metal racks. They caught a glimpse of a shadow, a person that darted behind a partition and vanished. Kyle didn't get a clear shot. "Hey," he called out, hoping the figure would hear him. "We're not here to harm anyone. We're just filming." No response. The trio cautiously looked around the steel rack, seeing no sign of footprints or escape routes. It was as if whoever, or whatever, they'd seen had melted into the darkness. Ellen could feel her heart thudding in her chest. Then she noticed odd, rust-like stains on the floor, dark splotches running along the base of the wall. "Is that blood?" she whispered, shining her light. Whatever it was, it looked like old, dark patches, possibly dried blood. "Might be from an animal," Josh muttered. "It's been a long time." The deeper they went, the more Kyle sensed they were descending into a real-life nightmare. Somewhere in the back of his mind was a voice telling him, "Get out now." But they pressed on, driven by curiosity and the need for content. Returning to the main hall, they heard footsteps echo down a corridor. They sprinted toward the sound, but found only emptiness. Tension was rising to a breaking point. "Let's at least step outside," Ellen suggested, and none of them protested. Outside, the night was even darker, the moon hidden behind clouds. Fog choked the campsite, and the air was thick with dread. A long, creaking noise, like a drawn-out sigh, echoed across the grounds. Gathering at the pickup to catch their breath, the group pulled out the battered diary they'd found. By the light of a small lantern, Ellen flipped through its pages. A boy had written about everyday camp life, friends, funny incidents. But near the end, his handwriting grew shaky and uneven. July 8th, 1979. I woke up at night because I heard footsteps outside our cabin. I thought it was the counselor checking on us, but I saw something dark out the window. It didn't look human. It just stood there, staring right at me. July 9th, 1979. I told Mr. Jenkins about what I saw, but he said I was making things up to scare the younger kids. I'm not lying. I'm sure something's walking around at night. Someone or something. July 10th, 1979. Sam disappeared. Nobody has seen him since lights out. I asked Mr. Jenkins, but he says Sam must have wandered into the woods or pulled a prank. I don't believe it. We're all scared. We hear howling at night, and they say strange lights show up around the lake. It can't be a coincidence. Then the entries stopped abruptly. I'm afraid I might be next. "This is terrifying," Kyle muttered, "but maybe just a kid's imagination." "Something definitely happened in this camp," Ellen objected. Josh looked out at the silhouettes of redwoods under the moonlight. "I think we should get out of here ASAP, but let's try to capture a bit more footage for the final segment. Maybe those lake lights the kid mentioned." They agreed, hoping they could avoid further trouble. Yet all of them were on edge, following an old trail. They trudged through the creeping mist. Branches creaked overhead, and sometimes their flashlights painted bizarre shadows across the trees. Eventually, They reached a small lake, hidden among the colossal redwoods, its surface faintly shimmering in the moonlight. No croaking frogs, no rustling reeds. Only the ghostly glow of fog drifted across the water's surface. Kyle switched his camera to night mode, carefully filming. Josh walked along the shore, shining his flashlight onto the ground. Ellen hung back, watching the moonlight illuminate the rotting pier, half submerged. "It's both beautiful and terrifying," she whispered, feeling a chill in her bones. Suddenly Kyle, standing by the water's edge, shouted, "Guys, did you see that?" They all turned at once. A few dozen feet away, over the lake's surface, a faint bluish glow flickered, like a small orb. It vanished almost as soon as they spotted it. Then, off to the side, a pale greenish light flared up. "Oh my God," Josh whispered, trying to catch them on camera. "Are these swamp gases or bioluminescence? I'm not sure." The lights blinked on and off, drifting across the lake in an otherworldly dance. "Maybe it's a natural phenomenon," Ellen ventured, "but it's giving me goosebumps." Suddenly, one of the glowing orbs moved closer to shore. It blinked a few times and then went dark, as if plunging beneath the surface. At the same moment, the fog swirled as if driven by an invisible wind. "Let's get out of here," Kyle suggested, his voice shaky. "I don't like these things." They turned to leave, but heard snapping branches from the woods behind them. Everyone spun around. Kyle's flashlight just barely caught a glimpse of something. It seemed vaguely human-shaped, either short or crouched on all fours. Hard to tell. Then it slipped behind a tree. "Did you see that too?" Ellen asked. "Yeah, oh man." Josh exhaled. There was no denying it now. They weren't alone in these woods. Panic set in, and they decided they had to get back to the pickup right away and leave. But finding the road was tricky. The fog had grown thick, making every tree look the same. Their flashlights kept flickering, as though the batteries were draining unusually fast. "Stay together," Kyle yelled, aware that splitting up would be a disastrous idea. Fear and adrenaline took over. At one point, Ellen tripped over a broken platform and nearly fell into a weed-choked ditch. While Kyle and Josh helped her, a loud crack of splintering branches sounded behind them, followed by a pained moan. The fog was so dense it seemed like any creature could creep right up without a sound. "Run!" Josh shouted, gripping Ellen's hand. Kyle tried to keep up, but he sensed something cold, wet, and fleshy brush his shoulder. A wave of panic seized him, and he sprinted after the others, camera capturing only blurred beams of light. At last, they reached the row of cabins where the pickup stood like a beacon of salvation. But they found the tailgate ajar and the driver's side door wide open. Someone had been inside. Even stranger, wet pine needles had been deliberately scattered all over the back seats. "What the?" Josh exclaimed, peering into the cabin. "What on earth?" Kyle checked the cargo area where their extra gear was stored. Some boxes had been moved, tripods tossed about, yet nothing appeared stolen. The visitor had only rummaged. "We're leaving right now," Ellen said shakily. "I don't care who's out there in the woods. Let's go." They piled into the truck. Josh tried the ignition. It coughed a few times and died. Fog drifted around the vehicle like a living curtain. Sweat beaded on Josh's forehead. "Piece of junk engine," he growled, twisting the key. "Come on." Finally, it roared to life. "Yes!" Josh yelled, putting the truck in gear. "We're out of here." He drove ahead, the fog parting as though opening a path. They began to feel relieved, until something darted in front of the headlights. Josh jerked the steering wheel, and the truck skidded. It veered toward a signpost reading "No Trespassing," crashed into it, and stalled out. Kyle cried out, knocked around by the collision, and Ellen clutched her bruised knee. Josh had hit his forehead on the steering wheel, but not too badly. Shaken, they realized the truck's nose was buried in a ditch. "It's not moving," Josh groaned, revving the engine, tires spinning uselessly. In shock, they stumbled out, fog pressing in on them again. Between the dark trunks, they swore multiple shapes flitted by, surrounding them like a pack. "Head for the exit," Ellen shouted, adrenaline surging. "We can walk to the nearest town." They grabbed flashlights and the camera, abandoning most of their gear, and sprinted toward the spot where they remembered the old arch at the camp's entrance. But every path looked the same in the swirling fog. Minutes of frantic searching passed, and they realized they were lost. "This isn't right," Kyle gasped, struggling for breath. "We're going in circles." Suddenly, Ellen realized Josh was no longer with them. She and Kyle halted, scanning the darkness. "Josh, where are you?" The only reply was a distant scream, then silence. Without thinking, they ran in that direction, shining their trembling flashlights. No one answered. The forest had swallowed Josh just as it had swallowed campers decades before. Kyle and Ellen darted among the giant redwoods, calling out for Josh. The fog, like a living wall, absorbed their voices. Branches above them creaked, and shadows seemed to shift at the edges of the light. "We can't just leave him," Ellen sobbed, clutching the old diary as if it were a talisman. "We won't," Kyle shouted back, "but we don't even know which way to go." Twigs snapped all around them. Sometimes they caught glimpses of a dark shape and gave chase, only to find empty air. The thick carpet of pine needles muffled every step, meaning something, or someone, could sneak up silently. And it felt like that was exactly what was happening, toying with them. Finally, they stumbled into a clearing surrounded by colossal redwoods. Their flashlights caught a flicker of movement against the bark. A figure detached from one of the trunks. It was short, or maybe hunched, draped in tattered clothing. Kyle held his breath as Ellen stepped back, heart hammering in her chest. The shape seemed human, but its face, or what remained, was twisted in the moonlight. Eye sockets were black holes, or maybe just unnatural darkness. A ghastly grimace spread across its features, and it let out a low, resonant moan. "Run!" Ellen screamed, and they bolted. Yet the creature lurched after them, surprisingly fast for its weird posture. Kyle heard something crunch under his foot, and out of the corner of his eye, he caught another dark form rising from behind a tree. There were more of them in these woods. After a terrifying chase, Kyle and Ellen finally spotted the old arch at Redwood Camp's entrance. Part of a fallen tree blocked it. "Climb over, now." Kyle scrambled across the trunk, Ellen close behind. On the other side, the fog thinned. Through the trees, they could see the worn dirt road leading to the highway. Both collapsed onto the ground, panting, hardly believing they'd escaped the camp's boundaries. "What about Josh?" Ellen cried, turning back toward the darkness under the arch. But the forest was silent. They realized returning for him was suicide. They had no plan or strength left. Half an hour later, staggering along the road, they reached a gas station. They frantically told their story. Locals called the police. At dawn, officers and search crews combed the area around the camp and the adjacent woods. they found no sign of Josh, or of any struggle. The pickup sat where they'd left it, crashed into the signpost. There were footprints from two people, presumably Kyle and Ellen. Officially, no one gave credibility to tales of something in the woods. The authorities wrote it off as an accident amid a panicked flight. Kyle and Ellen gave statements and turned over the old diary, hoping it might shed light on Josh's disappearance. But evidence seemed too bizarre for police to take seriously. Everyone hoped Josh might turn up wandering in the surrounding area, but days passed with no word. A week later, Kyle uploaded fragments of their footage to the channel. Nighttime exploration of the cabins, faint glowing lights on the lake, eerie noises in the mess hall. The final clip showed them fleeing through the fog, the camera wavering and capturing only fleeting glimpses. Just before cutting out, the screen revealed a shape gliding among the redwoods. The video went viral, drawing millions of views and fiery debates online. Some called it fake. Others were certain the group had encountered something supernatural in Redwood Forest. There was no trace of Josh. Ellen quickly deleted her social media. Kyle posted a brief apology video on their channel, explaining he would never film such content again. "I'm sorry, guys. We crossed a line. I just want my friend back alive," he said. A few months passed. One evening, a lumber company's security guard called the police, reporting he'd spotted a disoriented man with a blank stare and bloody clothes on an old access road. When the guard tried to approach, the man bolted back into the redwoods. His face was pale as a ghost, his arms trembling. The incident remained unsolved, and Josh was never found. Locals say that on foggy nights near Redwood Camp's entrance, a lone figure sometimes appears, a wanderer, or perhaps another victim of the forest dwellers. Ask folks in the nearby towns whether you should visit the cursed camp, and they'll almost always respond, "Not if you value your life."